Henry Ashford here, asking you to picture the world's most athletic event, the Olympic marathon, being contested by men wheezing through dust clouds, chased by stray dogs, and occasionally revived with a spoonful of egg whites mixed with rat poison. Yes, that actually happened, and yes, someone thought it was a good idea. If that image has lodged itself in your brain for the night, go ahead and like this video, subscribe for more late-night historical oddities, and tell me in the comments what unconventional snack you would pack for a marathon that doubles as a mild poisoning experiment. Personally, I might just settle for a granola bar. The year was 1904, and the Summer Olympics had agreed to share space with the St. Louis World's Fair, which meant that the event was going to be less refined international athleticism and more chaotic exposition sideshow. The marathon itself began under the blazing Missouri sun, on roads that looked like abandoned construction sites, without water stations, without medical staff, and mostly without adult supervision. What unfolded was not so much a race as a travelling comedy of errors starring the bravest lungs and the poorest decisions the city could provide. So there they were, 32 men lined up for glory in the sweltering Missouri heat, blinking through dust as if they had signed up for a sponsored coughing contest. Most marathons are a test of endurance, but this one was more of a raffle ticket. The prize, survival. Local officials had decided that providing water along the course might take some of the challenge out of distance running, and so the thirsty athletes trudged onward past country roads littered with loose stones, wagon ruts, and the occasional confused mule, who at least had the sense to stop moving when tired. It was less an Olympic venue and more a farm errand gone seriously wrong. Naturally, this is where the conflict came in. The men were not only competing against each other, but also against the environment, the planners, and sometimes against their own caretakers. One competitor's coach viewed the marathon as an exciting opportunity for live medical experimenting, carrying with him a supply of rat poison and brandy, as though he were preparing for either a race or a Victorian parlour dare. Another runner took one look at the dust and simply caught a ride partway in an automobile, waving cheerfully to pedestrians as though this was simply a genteel Sunday outing. Official oversight, meanwhile, was so casual that you half expect the judges spent more time critiquing funnel cakes at the fair than watching the finish line. All of it, impossibly, was considered sport. To understand how the 1904 Olympic marathon became a sun-baked hallucination with medals, we must roll back the calendar a little. Picture the United States at the dawn of the 20th century, full of ambition, odd ideas, and a deep, almost spiritual trust in boiled beef and unsolicited patriotism. The Olympics, still a relatively experimental venture, were coming to America for the first time. Originally scheduled for Chicago, the Games were scooped out from under like a pie at a church social and relocated to St. Louis to coincide with the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, more fondly known as the World's Fair. Because nothing says cutting-edge athletic excellence like sharing space with butter sculptures and a full replica of the Belgian Congo. The World's Fair was a sprawling celebration of human progress, colonial ambition, and extremely questionable zoology. While visitors marvelled at electric lighting, chewing gum, and imported tribespeople presented as living exhibits, the Olympic Games tried earnestly but ineffectually to matter. Over 6 months of intermittent events, the Games staggered forward much like the marathon itself, hopeful, underfunded, and slightly dazed. The Korean delegation arrived without shoes, the gymnastics competition featured rope climbing, and the tug-of-war was taken very seriously indeed. resulting in sprained dignity on more than one occasion. Amid this strange stew of turn-of-the-century optimism and logistical indigestion, the marathon emerged as the crown jewel of chaos. St. Louis in August was, how shall we put this calmly, hostile to human life. Daytime temperatures strolled well past 90 degrees, and the air held onto humidity like a grudge. Medical science, meanwhile, was still shaking hands with the concept of germs, and hydration advice hovered somewhere between intuitive nonsense and medical slapstick. Race planners, in an act of what one might gently call philosophical oversight, decided to establish only 2 water stops across an unforgiving 24.8 miles. Their stated reason had something to do with testing the limits of human endurance. Their unstated reason may have been heat-stroke-induced apathy. Against this backdrop wandered our cast of characters, a group best described as enthusiastic if not indefinitely prepared. There were, of course, Americans, some keen amateur runners, others generously classified as athletic due to prior experience moving quickly. There were also international competitors, many of whom had endured multi-week ocean voyages, train mishaps, and quite possibly a hay cart or two just to reach Missouri. Among them, 2 South African runners arrived barefoot and apparently ran part of the race while skillfully dodging a pack of dogs. This was not metaphorical. The dogs were real. And then there was Fred Laws. Fred was a bricklayer when he wasn't racing, which, depending on your views on long-term hydration, might have been the safer career. Fred trained at night because of his job, and may have reasonably assumed the marathon would work similarly. Run for a bit, take a break, summon an automobile, resume as needed. He did just that, hopping into a car after cramping up around mile 9, and later rejoining the race on foot a few miles from the end. He crossed the finish line first, looking fresh and apparently rather pleased, leading officials to crown him the winner for a full 12 minutes before someone remembered they had a telescope and noticed his ride. When informed that vehicular assistance was frowned upon, Fred grinned and said it was all a joke. Olympic officials, not known for their stand-up comedy appreciation, disagreed. The actual winner, if one can use the term with a straight face, was Thomas Hicks, a British-born American who gave the kind of performance that would later inspire multiple sports medicine textbooks under the chapter titled "Please Do Not Do This." Hicks was administered a mixture of strychnine and egg whites by his trainers during the race, which is the sort of cocktail best left to historical reenactments and deeply unregulated chemistry clubs. Strychnine in small doses was believed to act as a stimulant, although it is also, more famously, a poison used to eliminate rats and possibly Victorian uncles with suspicious wills. By the final miles, Hicks had to be physically lifted across the finish line by his handlers, a technique now known as extreme assisted winning. But to blame the runners would be wildly unfair, for they were simply trying to compete amid what might be generously described as organised oversight. Race officials drove along the dusty roads in automobiles, stirring up thick clouds of choking dirt that coated lungs and visibility in equal parts. One might say the real terrain hazard was the Ford Model T and an optimistic sense of progress. Spectators stood sweating under parasols, cheering and occasionally fainting, while the athletes convulsed, hallucinated, or argued quietly with insects only they could see. Even inside the fairgrounds, a kind of unreality pervaded everything. The marathon route wandered in and out like a poorly drawn map from a theme park. Signs were minimal, direction was vague, and much like life, everyone sort of hoped they were going the right way. In some cases, they very much were not. Cuban runner Felix Carvajal, who had talked his way to St. Louis after losing his travel money in a dice game, paused around mile 10 to chat with spectators and pick fruit from an orchard. Unfortunately, the fruit was unripe. Even more unfortunately, Felix ate it anyway, sat down to digest and likely nodded off for a little while. His official time remains ambiguous, in the same way that dream time often doesn't correspond to real hours. By the end of the race, only 14 of the original 32 runners officially finished, although that number depends somewhat on how you define finish. Some collapsed just over the line, others wandered away mid-course, possibly into folklore. The winners were awarded medals, although the existential boundaries of what exactly they had won were less clear. A man was lauded for running without shoes, another praised for vomiting with quiet dignity, and the crowd slowly dispersed into the fairgrounds, where they could console themselves with things like root beer, carousel rides, and cultural exhibition pavilions that today would prompt 4 federal investigations and a lengthy apology. People often talk about triumph of the human spirit, but the 1904 marathon was more of a slightly confused shuffle of the human body, pushed to the brink by heat, dust, and deeply questionable supervision. Still, historians agree that its legacy lives on, not just as a sporting event gone adrift, but as a symbol of how far humanity will go for glory, even if part of that journey is done by car. And with that, the sun set over St. Louis. The exhausted runners were peeled from the track like overcooked pancakes, and the Olympics would never be quite the same again. But before we get to the finish line, we still have several hallucinations, a surprise arrest, and the world's most inconsistent coaching strategy to unpack. So, settle in. We're only halfway to madness. Among those orbiting the swirling core of this sun-baked chaos was James Sullivan, chief organizer and self-appointed visionary of the marathon. Sullivan believed deeply in the scientific management of sport, a phrase which in his hands translated loosely to minimizing hydration, maximizing heat exposure, and trusting nature to sort out the weak. An early adopter of the idea that sweat was suspicious, he limited water to what could be retrieved from a well-marked, generally potable at mile 12. The rest was up to the ambition of man and his inherent capacity to ignore all biological cues. Curiously, Sullivan was also interested in data collection. He saw the 1904 race not just as a sporting event, but as a scientific experiment. Unfortunately, this experiment lacked most of the essentials: ethical approval, double-blind procedures, and any semblance of informed consent. Coaches, under Sullivan's guidance, treated runners as mildly obedient laboratory mice, injecting them with strychnine, brandy, and egg whites at unpredictable intervals. One can only assume that someone somewhere was keeping careful notes in a journal labelled "Things my medical license should not endorse." Of course, any experiment is prone to interference, and in this case the biggest variable was the spectators. These weren't merely bystanders, they were deeply involved participants with strong opinions and occasional snacks. At mile 15, for instance, an especially chatty group attempted to offer one runner a lager, which he politely declined before tripping over a discarded parasol and rolling briefly down an embankment. To be fair, it was widely believed at the time that beer aided endurance, at least until one reached the part of the course known unofficially as the place where men rethink their choices. Enter Charles Lucas, a well-meaning but increasingly unhinged judge who followed the runners by automobile, offering both encouragement and clouds of fine particulate matter. Lucas viewed himself as a steward of sportsmanship, and carried with him a small notebook in which he documented perceived infractions, examples of valour, and at least one poetic meditation on the nature of heat stroke. He would later write that one runner looked like a man attempting to escape his own skeleton, which, if nothing else, shows a commitment to metaphor under deeply unsuitable conditions. Then came William Garcia, a Californian who nearly became a posthumous footnote. Garcia collapsed just 1 mile from the finish, hemorrhaging internally from the dust inhalation. He would later be revived in what newspapers referred to as miraculous fashion, though his physician might have preferred the phrase through blind luck and a basin of tepid water. Garcia had not been favoured to win, but he did become the strongest argument for filtering your air before running several miles through a botanical hellscape. Not to be outdone, Albert Corey, a French-American who had entered the race under somewhat disputed circumstances, ran most of the event with what appeared to be the vague belief that the finish line would appear to him when the time was right. Corey had no official team, few outspoken supporters, and a curious fascination with running in long flannel trousers, which he claimed anchored the spirit. He finished high enough to receive a medal of ambiguous origin, and later returned to France with a suitcase full of stories no one believed. Further along the route, 2 other competitors had their own unspoken competition. Who could make the most of their journey by absorbing all local agriculture? One, a Pennsylvania farmer-turned-runner named Sam Meller, grazed opportunistically on a vegetable patch while trying to soothe his churning stomach. The other, a Greek athlete known only as Demetrius, appeared for 6 miles at a respectable pace, before veering off into a vineyard, never to reappear. His fate remains unclear, though some say he found steady work assembling pickles at the jam-preserved tent near the fairground's western gate. Meanwhile, back at the start-finish area, news of Fred Laws's vehicular jaunt spread like wildfire, though with less clarity. Rumours escalated. Some claimed he had used a bicycle, others suggested a horse-drawn carriage, and one elderly witness insisted Fred had materialized from a dense shimmer, like a vision brought on by too much pickle brine. Olympic officials tried to restore order, briefly declaring the race null and void before being reminded that several people had suffered minor organ damage to complete it. As for Thomas Hicks, who had won in spite of himself and several key body systems failing simultaneously, his post-race condition defied both optimism and several scientific diagrams. He was carried off the track, placed in a bathtub filled with lukewarm vinegar, and declared alive but unconvinced. Doctors later noted that his pulse was high, erratic, and narratively satisfying. Hicks, once revived, muttered something about golden fields and invisible bridges, which was taken as evidence either of divine vision or the advanced effects of strychnine stew. Amid the sputtering resolution of this reluctant disaster, prizes were handed out. Not medals in the modern sense so much as decorative souvenirs, some hand-etched, others misprinted, one with the words "World's Fair Commemorative Spoon," where "marathon winner" should have been. Several recipients posed for photographs, still visibly shaking, caught between euphoria and scurvy. One tried to bite his medal, and instead bit the photographer's assistant out of confusion. As the last runners staggered in, received unofficial hugs, and dropped to their knees in either thanks or cellular disassembly, Charles Lucas closed his notebook. He had documented it all. The triumphs, the frauds, the sweating medical mysteries staggering through clouds of powdered road. He would later insist it was a fine event, much improved upon future reflection. One can only assume that reflection involved generous helpings of bourbon, and the quiet belief that perhaps no one would look too closely. And while most of the country moved on, vaguely aware that an Olympic marathon had occurred and possibly involved a horse or a ghost or a lost vineyard worker, the memory of that stifling August day in St. Louis settled deep into history, not as a monument to athletic achievement, but as an oversized footnote with dust on its suit and an ominous rattle from its water bottle. Truly, progress wears many faces, and sometimes it pants heavily beneath a parasol holding a questionable medal and trying not to faint in front of the butter sculpture of President Jefferson. But if you think we've reached the height of absurdity, you may want to find a blanket and a cold compress, because things are about to get even stranger. Meanwhile, somewhere along mile 9, a man named Felix Carvajal was deep in conversation with a peach. Felix, a Cuban mailman turned marathon enthusiast, had arrived in St. Louis without proper training, shoes, or any discernible plan. He had hitchhiked from New Orleans after losing all his money on a dice game, a decision that would later be described in his memoirs as bold, if not wise. He ran the race in wool trousers he'd cut off at the knee and a flannel shirt that appeared to be made entirely of scratchiness and optimism. The peach, for its part, was entirely silent, which Felix interpreted as encouragement. By the midpoint of the course, reality was starting to blur around the edges. The sun baked the Missouri dust into a fine talc that hung in the air like ancient curses, coating tongues, lungs, and good intentions alike. Race officials had put a water station at mile 6 and then, with an air of cheerful malevolence, never added another. This was part of an experiment in purposeful dehydration, apparently designed to answer the burning scientific question: what happens if you run 26 miles in summer with no water until your soul tries to exit through your armpits? The answer, it turns out, is not ideal. At one point, Thomas Hicks, the American favourite, began to fall apart like a poorly assembled meatloaf under pressure. His trainers, perhaps unclear on the difference between science and low-stakes poisonings, dosed him with a custom concoction of brandy, raw egg, and strychnine. The strychnine was meant to stimulate the nervous system. The result was more of a stepwise descent into sweaty delirium. He began insisting that the road was tilting uphill both ways, and that he could in fact hear the moon playing the violin. His support team saw this and concluded he was rallying. Somewhere around mile 15, a dust-covered horse pulling a wagon containing judges, race officials, and what looked suspiciously like 3 thermoses full of lemonade overtook the leading runners. The officials waved cheerily as their horse, named Pickles, trotted through the haze. Not one seemed to register that greeting marathoners from the comfort of a moving shade might be problematic. One overachieving judge even yelled encouragement through a brass megaphone. His exact phrase was "Go faster, the world's watching," spoken in a tone that suggested he himself had never jogged more than briskly to catch a streetcar. Fred Laws, the bricklayer who had earlier withdrawn due to cramping, had by now re-entered the race looking suspiciously refreshed. He had hitched a ride in his manager's car for about 11 miles, leaning out the window occasionally to wave and stretch. But when the car broke down, Fred shrugged, got out, and resumed running. By the time he arrived at the stadium, officials mistook his enthusiastic wave for a triumphant finish. The crowd erupted. Fred smiled, raised both arms, and accepted the cheers that came with being briefly and incorrectly declared the Olympic champion. No one questioned the fact that his shoes were somehow completely clean. His victory lap was cut short when someone noticed a distinct lack of dirt, sweat, and incoherent muttering usually associated with finishers. Interrogation followed. Fred, to his credit, confessed immediately and cheerfully, insisting it had all been a joke, an enormous joke, the kind involving deception, international spectators, and several judges on the verge of retiring early. Officials, with the weary sensitivity of exhausted babysitters, responded by revoking his title and issuing a lifetime ban that lasted precisely 1 year, after which he returned and won the Boston Marathon, possibly by running the whole distance this time. Meanwhile, back on the course, William Garcia of California was discovered semi-conscious in a ditch. He had inhaled so much dust that his stomach lining had begun to hemorrhage. His condition was described as critical, though, as the physician on duty had only a suitcase full of bandages and one opinion about hydration, treatment was mostly palliative shrugs. Garcia would later claim he nearly died, a statement no one disputed, mostly because it was clearly, obviously true to anyone with a functional sense of smell. Peter MacDonald and Sam Mellor, two of the next hopefuls, were battling each other somewhere past mile 17, with all the grim resolve of men convinced that this might still be worth it. Mellor collapsed once, then twice, revived each time by the same assistant who made a note of it in a notebook as if documenting bird sightings. Peter fell shortly after, and upon being asked where it hurt, simply said everywhere. Sam would go on to collapse a third time and remove himself from the race, not out of injury, but from a growing philosophical concern that he was being personally punished by the sun. And then there was the dust, the real star of the show. Not content to simply cloud the roads, it had begun infiltrating eyes, ears, shoes, and sandwiches. Spectators watching from the sidelines quickly began to resemble early prototypes of scarecrows, draped in picnic blankets and clutching parasols like relics from a drowned world. Children cried. Adults pretended it was part of the excitement. The ice cream vendors, those few still brave enough to operate under these conditions, served melted globs with the cheerful desperation of men who'd begun to forget what normal weather feels like. As for Thomas Hicks, the strychnine and egg parade continued. His handlers, sensing he might not make it through the final miles on twitching willpower alone, began dragging him forward by the armpits. His legs moved, mostly out of politeness. Spectators watched in stunned curiosity as he lurched past with hollow eyes, looking less like an athlete and more like a haunted marionette built entirely from wire, sweat, and trauma. By the time he crossed the finish line, he had lost 8 pounds and nearly his entire grasp on reality. The judges, in an act of collective hand-waving, deemed his victory legal. He was declared the winner, mostly because he at least appeared to be alive in person. Carvajal, the cheerful Cuban in cut-off pants, ambled in next and would have placed higher had he not stopped mid-race to attempt casual conversation with a family of farmers picnicking beneath an oak tree. They offered him apples, which he politely accepted, then promptly vomited, chalking it up to overexcitement or possibly pesticide. Still, he managed to finish the race smiling, which deeply confused everyone else. He did not win a medal, but did win considerable praise for finishing at all with no training, no money, and a pair of shoes that were almost certainly borrowed. By the end of the day, nearly everyone involved had collapsed, lied, been hallucinated, or participated in at least one decision that would later cause concern. The marathon had done exactly what the organisers did not anticipate. It became unforgettable. But not because of athletic glory. No, The 1904 marathon would be remembered for its grand disorganization, its joyful chaos, and the delicate way it allowed civilization to briefly plummet into cheerful absurdity, one dusty mile at a time. What was meant to crown heroes mostly just confused them, and somewhere in the distance Pickles the horse continued trotting calmly, perhaps the only competitor that day to retain both dignity and hydration. One of the quieter mysteries of the race was the unassuming presence of Frederick Laws, a young man with a charming smile and a bold disregard for the rules. Laws began running respectably enough, managing a few convincing miles before his body rebelled in protest, as if even his own muscles questioned the logic of pursuing human locomotion in 90-degree heat with minimal fluids. So, naturally he did what any rational marathoner in 1904 might consider. He hitched a ride. A spectator's car, possibly built for no more than pontoon rides around lakes, happened to be idling nearby, and Laws climbed in with the casual confidence of a man late for brunch. He rode for about 11 miles, waving occasionally to befuddled crowds, before the car broke down and the whole charade was forced to continue on foot. Rejuvenated by the brief flirtation with internal combustion, he re-entered the race and jogged triumphantly across the finish line. For several glorious minutes he was declared the winner. It took a small army of eyewitnesses and one very irate fellow runner to dislodge him from the podium. Meanwhile, the scientific community was well represented by Thomas Hicks, who became less of a marathoner and more of a walking medical experiment. Hicks's trainers, possibly influenced by a recent misunderstanding of alchemy, dosed him periodically with a namesake cocktail of strychnine and egg whites. Strychnine, of course, being the same substance commonly used to kill rats, now repurposed here to mildly incentivize cardiovascular ambition. Every few miles he was spoon-fed the mixture with the solemnity of communion, while his trainers flanked him like nervous pharmacists from a travelling sideshow. Near mile 20, Hicks began hallucinating that the road was rolling uphill, the sun was inside his skull, and that he was simultaneously leading the race and attending a polite tea with ghosts. The fact that he eventually crossed the finish line under his own power, or more accurately propped up by two men like a Victorian puppet, is arguably a medical miracle, and certainly a poor advertisement for scientific oversight. Amidst the chaos, another figure began to attract attention, not by cheating, collapsing, or ingesting poison, but by trying to actually run, which in context made him deeply suspicious. This was Felix Carvajal, a Cuban postman who had arrived in St. Louis with robust optimism and reportedly a pair of heavy dress shoes. Unable to afford real running gear, he raced in a stitched-together outfit that included cut-off trousers and a long-sleeved shirt, which he trimmed hastily with a pair of borrowed scissors. His preparation was mostly emotional. Carvajal paused frequently throughout the race, not from fatigue but from general curiosity. He stopped to chat with spectators, to ask about local flora, and at one point wandered off the course entirely to pick apples from an orchard. Unfortunately, the apples were not discussed in detail by historians, except to note that they were spoiled enough to cause severe cramping. He lay down under a tree for a nap, possibly dreaming of better produce, before returning to the course in high spirits. Despite this detour and a wardrobe better suited to sorting mail than distance racing, he managed to finish fourth. The dust, meanwhile, was a problem all its own. The race was run along unpaved country roads, most of which were in active use by automobiles with a deep personal grudge against air quality. As the runners huffed along, clouds of dust roiled up behind the cars like malignant spectres, flavoured lightly with exhaust. Doctors stationed along the route mostly absorbed this material directly into their lungs, their faces taking on the solemn, silent look of men rethinking their career paths. One official reportedly passed out from heat and confusion after trying valiantly to assist a racer who turned out to be a sack of flour dropped by one of the fairground's many travelling carnies. The sack did not finish the race, but was later thanked for its service. To add further texture to the proceedings, several stray dogs decided to join the event, possibly attracted by the rhythmic wheezing of the runners or the faint scent of egg whites on the wind. Most were content to follow along the outskirts, tails wagging patriotically, but one enterprising canine took a special interest in Arthur Newton, an American contestant with an unfortunate resemblance to a man who once denied a dog a pork chop. The dog chased Newton for nearly a mile before growing bored and trotting off in search of other disruptions. Historians differ on whether this incident improved or worsened Newton's time, but all agree it added spirit to the event and caused at least 2 onlookers to drop their peanuts in alarm. Not to be left out of the mounting absurdity, the race organisers decided halfway through the event to test another theory: selective dehydration. Intending to study the effects of thirst on athletic performance, they provided just one water station along the brutal 24-mile course. This station was more symbolic than functional, presided over by a man with a small bucket and an expression of mild regret. Some runners drank eagerly, others were too delirious to recognize what water was, and one reportedly tried to bathe in the bucket before politely being escorted away by a very exasperated judge. The conclusions of this experiment were inconclusive, though the participants overwhelmingly reported a deep and lasting appreciation for liquid in all its forms. In the background, the World's Fair continued as though nothing were happening. Diners sipped phosphated sodas under striped awnings, while men in top hats discussed dirigibles. No one seemed perturbed that nearby, human beings were collapsing like marionettes, muttering to themselves about invisible staircases. A band played cheerful ragtime not far from the finish line, their oblivious enthusiasm giving the final stretch a flavour reminiscent of a carnival gone gently feral. And then there was the matter of the medals. The judges, faced with a slowly assembling cast of sunburned hobblers and semi-conscious wanderers, began to lose their resolve. Medals were awarded less for placement and more for narrative value. Hicks, hallucinating and barely upright, was given the gold, mostly because he seemed unlikely to survive long enough for a revote. Laws, after initial celebrations and a cursory investigation, was disqualified and encouraged to try again in a less theatrical fashion. Felix Carvajal disappeared shortly after the race, reportedly in search of lunch, and declined any accolades with the humility of a man who had once tried to race on rotten fruit and goodwill alone. By the end of the day, the sky had turned a soft gold, and the roads bore only the quiet trails of abandoned footfalls and the occasional dropped handkerchief. A broom-wielding janitor from the fairgrounds came upon a solitary sneaker with no apparent owner. He picked it up, gave it a respectful nod, and placed it beside a half-eaten peach on a bench. It remains unclear whether either item was ever claimed, and yet, somehow, it still wasn't over. Around mile 16, the runners were no longer so much competing as mutually staggering through an elaborate shared delusion, pursued not by glory, but by the cruel indifference of the Missouri sun. It was at this point that Frederick Laws, the man who earlier hitched a ride in a car when jogging became too bothersome, decided to hop back onto the course. Thanking the car driver politely, he re-entered the race with the sort of nonchalant confidence typically reserved for men who are lying very badly. He ran the final few miles in fine health, crossed the finish line to thunderous applause, and was declared the winner. For approximately 7 minutes, he became the American hero everyone needed, until someone pointed out that he'd been seen earlier waving to spectators from the passenger seat of a car eating what might have been a sandwich. Back on the trail of tears and dehydration, Thomas Hicks, our rat poison enthusiast, was trudging forward with the shaky determination of a man who is unsure if what lies ahead is the finish line or the gates of some underworld. His trainers, because of course he had trainers, were administering heroic doses of egg whites laced with strychnine, a mild neurotoxin which, at the time, was considered cutting-edge athletic performance science. Watching Hicks run was like observing evolution in reverse, and yet, through some dark alchemy of perseverance and questionable medical ethics, he pressed on, limbs flailing, eyes wild, at one point begging for something no one was able to translate. He collapsed over the finish line like a sack of laundry someone had left out in the sun too long. Officials deemed him the real winner, possibly because he did technically run the entire course, and possibly because admitting otherwise would have involved paperwork. Meanwhile, another competitor, Felix Carvajal, the barefoot Cuban postman who had charmed spectators with mid-race conversations and improvised fruit theft, was somewhere out on the course engaged in a heated diplomatic exchange with a local dog. After consuming spoiled apples from a farmer's orchard, he had taken an extended nap in the grass, and now wobbled along with the tranquillity of a man no longer entirely familiar with the concept of time. He finished 4th, which felt just about right. He later claimed the race was one of the most enjoyable experiences of his life, proving that attitude really is everything, especially when you have no formal training and accidentally poisoned yourself with fermented produce. As the day wore on into its 8th punishing hour, race officials began to seriously question their life choices. Water had been provided in exactly 2 locations, one near a tower and one in the vague vicinity of a well, which had to be located using vague maps and intuition. The absence of hydration, combined with the suffocating dust kicked up by accompanying automobiles, each containing judges, reporters, and at least one man delivering ice cream sandwiches to the press, created a sort of game show atmosphere, one in which the prize was possibly death. Adding texture to the chaos was the performance of William Garcia, a Californian who was found by the side of the road semi-conscious, having inhaled so much dust that his esophagus resembled a themed fireplace. He was rushed to a hospital, which in 1904 meant someone yelled his name in alarm and placed a damp rag on his forehead. Doctors concluded he had narrowly escaped death, but would probably continue coughing up St. Louis for several days. Not to be outdone, a South African runner named Len Townyain ran a remarkable race considering he had never run a marathon before. He also lost valuable time after being chased by a dog. It is not clear if the dog belonged to someone or just wanted to see how many Olympians it could catch before sunset, but according to one witness, the animal seemed pleased with itself. Len, ever resilient, shook off the interruption and pressed on, ultimately finishing 9th, which in that context might as well have been first. At one point, a man in formal attire, silk cravat and all, attempted to hand runners pamphlets explaining the benefits of electrotherapy. He claimed it improved muscle performance and mental toughness. He was politely ignored, though one runner did accept a card and tucked it into his shoe for later consideration. Unfortunately, the card later fused with his sock due to significant foot sweat, and to this day, electrotherapy has never been formally tested mid-race. Back at the finish line, crowds were now equal parts confused and sunburned, murmuring nervously and dripping lemonade. Children were crying, not because anything was wrong, but simply because the general atmosphere suggested they should. Vendors had switched from selling commemorative buttons to selling shade, physically moving umbrellas from one family to another at hourly rates. Someone played a banjo to lift spirits. It did not help. By the time the final runners trickled in, the judges, most of whom had visibly aged several years during the course of the afternoon, had developed a new enthusiasm for declaring results as quickly as possible, often based on vague memory or strong hunches. Medals were awarded, rescinded, then re-awarded. No one seemed entirely sure who finished when or how. One runner may not have even been registered, but was allowed to keep his medal because he seemed nice and promised not to tell anyone. In a post-race interview such as it was, Frederick Laws admitted to the car ride, describing it as a joke. Officials were less amused and banned him for life, or at least until the following year, when they quietly reinstated him because his stride was reportedly very elegant. Meanwhile, Thomas Hicks, now resting under the care of people with access to wholesome fluids, remained barely conscious but was congratulated extensively for surviving both the race and his own medical team. As night fell over St. Louis, the dust finally settled, quite literally, though many claim they continued coughing for weeks after. The marathon had officially ended, though several participants reportedly kept running out of habit, last seen heading west toward less judgmental terrain. The event was declared a historic success, largely because no official definition of disaster yet existed for this particular genre of sporting event. In the weeks that followed, the organisers quietly modified future marathon protocols to include suggestions such as water, shade, shoes, and perhaps a mild discouragement of dogs and hallucinogenic substances. But in the official report, the 1904 Olympic Marathon remained a celebrated milestone of human endurance, conveniently omitting the part where one man rode in a car, another dreamed he was having tea, and the winner had to be carried, semi-poisoned, across the finish line like a limp Victorian houseplant. History has not forgotten. It just occasionally chooses not to explain itself. Meanwhile, back near the 11th mile marker, Cuban postman Felix Carvajal, still wearing his street clothes, which included wool trousers hastily cut into shorts with a pocket knife borrowed from a sceptical peanut vendor, had paused his run to pick fruit from an orchard. He was under the impression they were apples. They were not. They were green, questionably ripe, and laced with whatever natural chemicals happen when you harvest unwashed Missouri produce in late August. Minutes later, Felix was curled in a ditch, giggling softly and attempting to negotiate with a fence post he believed was a customs officer. Naturally, officials made a note that he had briefly lagged. Back on the course, Fred Laws, the man who famously hitched a ride in a car for about 11 miles and then jogged the final stretch just in time to wave to the crowd like a homecoming queen, had already been declared the winner. Photos were taken, people cheered, and someone offered him a plate of cold ham. But just before the medals could be formally awarded, word arrived that Laws had in fact cheated by accidentally being driven most of the way. Specific accounts vary, but reportedly he told people it was all a joke, a little prank, just a good-natured goof conducted under the blazing 40-degree sun in front of a paying audience. This did not go over particularly well with the delegation from Sweden, who had travelled by boat for several weeks expressly to avoid this kind of foolishness. At the judge's tent, officials debated what to do about the increasingly surreal turn of events, while surrounded by rotting peach pits and one half-deflated balloon animal left over from a children's archery demonstration. Eventually they handed the gold medal to Thomas Hicks, who had technically crossed the finish line without vehicular assistance, though not without pharmacological aid. Hicks, you may recall, had spent most of the race suffering hallucinations, including one where he believed he was shrinking. Onlookers described him as looking a little grey, which was contemporary shorthand for someone likely to die at any given moment. 2 attendants carried him off the track in a blanket and deposited him gently beside a lemonade stand, operated by 3 completely unfazed teenage girls. While all that played out centre stage, the lesser-known competitors were faring creatively. Len Tonyan, one of the first black athletes to participate in the Olympics, had made good time early on, until he was chased off course by a stray dog near mile 14. No one knows where the dog came from. It had no collar, no leash, and apparently no schedule. Witnesses at the time simply stated, it looked determined. Len ran several extra miles attempting to escape it, which might be considered inspirational if the whole scenario had not been an unintentional audition for a silent film chase sequence. He recovered, rejoined the race, and finished 9th, which under the circumstances feels suspiciously like excellence. As the awareness spread that the marathon had descended into unrehearsed street theatre, the mood among spectators took a strange turn. People stopped cheering and began hawking lemonade, newspapers, and souvenir fans shaped like Abraham Lincoln's face. A man in a velvet waistcoat offered foot massages for a dime. 3 women sold watermelon slices to anyone who agreed not to ask how the race was going. The whole event drifted toward performance art with running as the loose theme. The International Olympic Committee, which at the time consisted mostly of bored aristocrats, and a man who kept calling himself the Baron despite lacking any official title, met the following day to review the outcome. They expressed concern about the peculiar logistics. Apparently some of them had caught wind of the fact that poison was used as a stimulant, and felt that perhaps, going forward, the game should lean toward hydration and away from Victorian-era medical experiments. The Baron chose not to comment directly, but did mention in passing that he had never trusted Americans to properly sweat anyway, which is probably not what one would consider helpful feedback. In the days that followed, the results of the marathon were published in newspapers worldwide. A few articles got the names right, most did not. Some even omitted the fact it was a race, describing it as an endurance display, a spirited jaunt, or in one Austrian paper, an agricultural exploration accompanied by light jogging. Felix Carvajal's performance was especially hard to summarise, perhaps because most journalists struggle to categorise mid-race fruit foraging as a competitive strategy. As word of the marathon's disorganisation spread, various amateur athletic associations and temperance leagues weighed in with sternly worded letters. One, printed in the Chicago Courier, asked if organisers would consider using water next time, assuming they have heard of it. Another simply read, "Stop this madness," and was signed by a coalition of concerned mothers from Des Moines. Of course, the letter arrived well past the conclusion of the race, and was promptly used to level a chair in the planning office's temporary tent. Back at the fairgrounds, Thomas Hicks was recovering from his victory. He had been fed milk, given a sponge bath by confused but determined volunteers, and was reportedly still convinced he might be hallucinating. To calm him, someone gave him a small flag. Supposedly he waved it for several hours, believing he was signalling airplanes. Commercial flight would not exist for another decade, but no one corrected him. At that point, sympathy and confusion had become deeply intertwined. Within the week, the marathon course was paved over and repurposed for bicycle demonstrations, several impromptu picnics, and at least one wedding. No one could remember exactly where the course had started, so multiple finish lines were eventually marked in pencil on various fairground maps. None of them were especially accurate. One was in the middle of a bandstand, and another crossed the path of a mule ride attraction. In their defence, it was hard to be precise when the original route had involved so many detours, dogs, and medically dubious snack breaks. As for the runners themselves, many simply went home. A few competed in later races, and others confined their athletic pursuits to less chaotic arenas, like gardening or light carpentry. Fred Laws, in the end, was allowed to run competitively again, proving that America has always had a soft spot for cheaters who apologize with enough charm and upper arm strength. Felix Carvajal returned to Cuba, where he resumed his life of modest fame and irregular income. He claimed he would train better in the future. Nobody told him the next Olympics would involve even more hurdles, some figurative, others annoyingly literal. So the dust settled. Spectators went home with aching feet and ambiguous stories. The feral dog was not seen again, but did reportedly father a small line of very opinionated terriers. And in a quiet corner of St. Louis, someone finally found the original race map, folded into an envelope and used as a coaster beneath a glass of tepid sarsaparilla. The ink had run. The path was unclear, but somehow that felt just right. Unbeknownst to the dwindling crowd still loitering near the dusty finish line, the organisers quietly realised that no one had kept accurate track of how many runners had started the race. Numbers were scribbled onto sheets of paper that had, at some point, been used as napkins for corn dogs and lemonade. A man named Chester Wilborn, who had never intended to run at all but had wandered onto the course looking for the zoological pavilion, was now being awarded 12th place and a complimentary pickle. Meanwhile, the poisoned runner, Thomas Hicks, was being propped up like a church puppet backstage. 2 handlers carried him gently by the armpits, feet dragging in the powdery earth, as his eyes attempted to evacuate his skull through sheer force of confusion. Observers described him as looking like a man trying to exit his own dream. He eventually smiled faintly, although it is unclear whether he believed he'd won the marathon or simply remembered the taste of solid food. At this point, several participants were still missing. Cuban postman Felix Carvajal, who'd paused mid-race to snack on some unwashed apples and then nap under a sycamore tree, emerged several hours later with a weathered leaf in his hair and a story about a philosophical conversation with a local raccoon. He insisted he'd won in spirit, and possibly in distance, depending on one's definition of the route. He was given a handshake and a slice of fairground cake, which was later found to contain glitter. In what resembled an epilogue to an already overlong farce, a dispute arose between 2 race officials about whether Hicks's win should be considered chemically enhanced. The argument took place over tepid root beer and lasted 45 minutes, during which a small child wandered into the records tent, reorganised the finishers list alphabetically, and accidentally reshuffled Olympic history. As a result, a man named Eli Brewster from Montana, who had not run at all but had signed up as a decoy flag bearer, briefly appeared in newspapers as the sixth-place finisher. Elsewhere, one of the support cars broke down in a field of dry thistles, marooning its occupants for the night. Among them was Frederick Laws, the runner who had infamously caught a lift in a vehicle before jogging across the finish line with the confidence of a man certain no one had noticed. Ironically, the car he had briefly used for cheating was now also cheating him out of dinner and a ride home. He passed the time drawing moustaches on discarded pamphlets for the Belgian Waffle Pavilion. As the sun set over St. Louis, the fair's organisers quietly removed the marathon course signs, not out of closure, but out of a vague sense that the event might restart again if they left them up. Somewhere near mile 9, a runner from South Africa named Len Tau, who'd been chased off the course earlier by a pack of stray dogs, reappeared triumphantly, holding a pine cone like a trophy. He had outrun the dogs, he explained, then taken a scenic detour near the anthropology exhibit, where he debated philosophy with a vendor selling ostrich boas. In the final tally, of the 32 men who had nominally begun the race, fewer than half actually completed it, and even fewer remembered doing so with any clarity. One athlete woke up under a grandstand surrounded by pamphlets about dairy innovation, and assumed, for several panicked moments, that he had slept through the entire Olympic Games. He later remembered he was technically a wrestler, not a runner, raising new questions about just how confusing the signage had been that day. The medical tent resembled less an infirmary and more a bizarre experimental salon. The attending physician was still taking notes on the effects of strychnine and egg whites, occasionally stopping to ask questions like whether anyone had temporarily seen through time. One of the volunteers attempted to rehydrate the more dehydrated athletes using ladles and a bucket labelled mostly water. Spirits were high, considering most of the participants had now passed from delirium into a sort of meditative acceptance. Some enterprising children began selling commemorative rocks gathered from the marathon course. These rocks were indistinguishable from ordinary rocks, save for the hastily painted labels in red chalk that said Olympic Pebble. One enthusiastic buyer, possibly under the impression the rocks had been kicked by famous feet, purchased 17 before collapsing gently behind the lemonade stand. He later became mayor of a small town in Missouri, running on a platform of hydration realism and common-sense road signage. The official closing ceremony of the marathon consisted of a man walking up a small wooden stage and ringing a cowbell. No speeches were given, no national anthems played. A dog barked 3 times in a vaguely appreciative rhythm, and then everyone went home. The few actual finishers were given medals on ribbons that had previously adorned boxes of regional cheeses. Someone attempted to give Hicks a laurel wreath, but they had run out of real leaves and substituted a glorified doily. And still, the strangest detail might be the presence of Charles Lucas, the man who had lobbied to make the marathon part of the World's Fair to begin with. He was last seen reclining on a lawn chair under a large parasol, sipping diluted vinegar through a metal straw and taking notes for future events. When asked if he considered the race a success, he simply nodded and said, "Well, no one died, technically." Nearby, a forgotten watermelon cart rolled slowly downhill, gathering dust as it wobbled toward an uncertain fate. It eventually struck a lamp-post, freeing a small bird that had inadvertently been trapped in a bunting banner. The bird flew off toward the river, perhaps in search of a more coherent sporting event. And so the 1904 Olympic Marathon drew to its lopsided, dusty halt, a race where victory was loosely defined, hydration was scarce, and the rules regarding automobile use were open to interpretation. It would be remembered not for athletic glory, but for the singular impression it left on everyone involved, that the line between chaos and tradition is thinner than an egg-white cocktail stirred under a Missouri sun. And just when it seemed the marathon could not slip any further off the rails, a new figure entered the stage. Fred Laws, an affable New Yorker with an easy grin and legs more suited for sauntering than sprinting, reappeared at the stadium nearly an hour after he'd been spotted riding in an automobile. He jogged calmly across the finish line, arms raised in victory, as several thousand spectators burst into spontaneous applause. For a few shining minutes, he was hailed as the champion of the Olympic marathon. Flowers were handed to him. Dignitaries extended their hands. A young girl from the fair presented him with a commemorative silver teaspoon, which she had stolen from the anthropology pavilion. Lawes accepted the adoration with all the grace of a man who perhaps knew he had just pulled off a modest con in broad daylight. It was only when another runner, Thomas Hicks, began approaching the stadium, shivering and muttering Latin conjugations from his college days, that murmurs started fluttering through the crowd. Officials investigated. One spectator claimed to have seen Lawes emerging from the back of a Model T that had stalled just half a mile from the track. Confronted with gently accusatory questions and the slow-building suspicion of a makeshift Olympic Inquisition, Lawes blinked twice and offered what might be the most beautifully understated confession in the history of sports. He said it had all been a joke, just a prank, a merry little ruse with no real ambition. One cannot help but wonder if he might have gotten away with it entirely, had he not triumphantly raised both arms like a man conducting an invisible orchestra. Meanwhile, Thomas Hicks, still considered the legitimate competitor, was descending into a physiological state no man should ever experience voluntarily. Having been fed a dubious cocktail of strychnine, a chemical more commonly used to discourage rats than to encourage humans, plus brandy and egg whites every few miles, Hicks was essentially propelled by poison and pride. By mile 20, his skin had changed colour. By mile 21, his trainers reported he believed his shins were made of glass. Still, they urged him forward with gentle lies and firm shoves. In any modern event, he would have been escorted directly to intensive care. In St. Louis, he was given more egg. The roads themselves, not to be outdone, contributed to the madness. Designed with more optimism than engineering skill, they alternated between soft Missouri mud and hard-packed cattle trail. Every few yards, runners encountered surprise hazards, potholes the size of soup tureens, misplaced flagpoles, and once a small parade of pan flutes rehearsing for Latvia Day near mile 18. The music had an unsettling effect on already disoriented athletes, and one Belgian runner reportedly stopped mid-stride to ask if anyone else could see the goat playing flute on two legs. There was no goat, at least none officially documented. In the background of this slow, hallucinatory unravelling, a group of Cuban spectators had taken up what might best be described as inattentive gambling. They wagered on various runners not by time but by posture. A man doubled over at mile 12 was given 7-1 odds of finishing. Another man who insisted on running backwards for several yards, a decision said to be tactical but likely vertigo-induced, received brief but enthusiastic support before collapsing behind a lemonade stand and falling asleep on a crate of turnips. Even as chaos bloomed in every direction, the officials seemed determined to maintain the illusion that an organised event was occurring. They dressed in white linen suits, carried clipboards that held nothing written, and occasionally whistled in a manner that suggested authority without specific direction. One judge, attempting to regulate water distribution, simply stood at mile 13 next to a bucket with a ladle and asked runners if they were feeling whimsical or robust. Those who chose whimsical were allowed a sip. Those who didn't answer were handed a saltine cracker and waved along. By the time Hicks finally staggered into the stadium, trailing behind his trainers like a Victorian ghost hunter in a medical emergency, the crowd was unsure whether to cheer or call a priest. He was twitching involuntarily. His pupils dilated to the size of nickels, and his limbs jerked like a marionette operated by someone with unfinished business. Nonetheless, he was declared the winner. He was given a gold medal and a folded American flag while lying face down on a stretcher, his mouth still moving in uneven approximations of triumphant speech. Later, he confessed he had no memory of the race, the victory, or the egg whites. He did, however, remember the smell of pine tar and the distinct impression that squirrels were judging him. As the day drew to a close, 3 runners remained unaccounted for. One was eventually discovered asleep beneath a tree near the 25th mile marker, clutching a jar of honey he claimed had been given to him by a kindly woman who appeared suddenly and vanished more mysteriously. There had in fact been no women allowed on the course. Another was found several hours later in the agricultural exhibit, attempting to barter his racing shoes for canned beets. The 3rd runner simply never reappeared, giving rise to a minor regional myth in which a marathoner wanders the forests of Missouri to this day, still chasing water that isn't there. Despite every possible indication to the contrary, the marathon was declared a success. Officials published gushing statements in respectable newspapers, praising the stamina and spirit of the athletes, though notably avoiding mention of the rodents, the hallucinations, or the brief and very unauthorized automobile segment. Olympic authorities in Europe read the reports with polite confusion and began drafting stricter rules for future games, including the rather important clarification that athletes should complete the race entirely under their own power. Behind the scenes, someone quietly boxed up the silver medals, still barely tarnished from their time resting near a vat of expired mayonnaise. The medals were offered to the runners who finished 2nd and 3rd, though both expressed a level of emotional exhaustion, best captured in long sighs and distant gazes. One of them refused the medal outright, instead requesting a sandwich and an apology. He received the former. As the sun dipped behind the Ferris wheel and the remains of the marathon were swept from the street by a pair of janitors assigned to the dairy exhibit, the city of St. Louis returned to its fair-time rhythm. Children begged for popcorn, adults admired the electricity demonstration, and just a few yards from the scene of one of the most mismanaged athletic events in human memory, a man in a pickle costume danced slowly to ragtime music, offering free samples no one requested. It was, in the simplest terms, a day that defied explanation while demanding documentation, and so we remember it, not for records broken or distances conquered, but for the way humanity sometimes insists on attempting greatness while spectacularly misunderstanding the assignment. The 1904 Olympic marathon did not crown champions so much as survivors, and even they looked a little unsure about the whole thing in retrospect. And so, as the sun slipped lower over the pancaked dirt roads outside St. Louis, the last runners wobbled, crawled, or simply evaporated across the finish line. Officials, sun-addled themselves, tried to piece together who had actually run the race, who had merely wandered into it looking for a public bath, and who might still be out there somewhere, lost in the Missouri countryside arguing with a tree trunk. Many spectators had long since wandered off to the fairgrounds to enjoy a sensible exhibit on butter sculpting or patent medicine, leaving behind a few concerned pigeons and one man asleep in a folding chair holding a melted lemon ice. Someone announced a winner. No one was entirely confident it was correct, but they'd run out of participants to disqualify, so it seemed polite to move on. Thomas Hicks, the man bolstered into victory by sincere ambition and small doses of industrial rat poison, was carried away like a champion gladiator too tired to cry. He repeatedly asked where he was. His trainers lied cheerfully. Someone waved an American flag near his face. He squinted at it and asked whether it was a bedsheet. In a gently ironic footnote, Hicks later said he never would have finished the race without that helpful concoction of brandy, poison, and meringue. A combination that, in any other context, might be considered a method of assassination. His caretakers agreed it had worked beautifully, and perhaps with just a splash more strychnine, he'd have broken the world record and also possibly died. Science is about trade-offs. Fred Laws, who had hitched most of his marathon aboard a spectator's car and then jogged back to the stadium to pretend he had won, was temporarily banned for fraud. But his punishment was short-lived. Officials soon realized that the entire event had been such a rampant error in human management that his crime was, essentially, trying to add narrative structure to chaos. They reinstated him after a public apology, and Fred went on to become a legitimate marathon champion. Though people did sometimes squint at his feet to check if they were touching the pavement. Cuban mailman Felix Carvajal, who had paused mid-race to eat some spoiled apples, vomited, took a nap, and still finished ahead of men with PhDs in sprinting, continued to live a richly strange life. He later attempted another long-distance race in Havana, wearing his trusty street shoes and a sense of optimism that could not be smothered by blisters. He remained proud of his Olympic appearance, despite the disorienting combination of fatigue, fruit, and abdominal regret. As for the South African runners, Len Townyain and Jan Mashiani, they were mostly forgotten by the American press, though by all accounts they had been among the only people who actually ran the entire race on foot. Len, who had to dodge a dog somewhere near mile 9, never got a medal. But he did get a full story to tell, one that involved exactly 0 theatrical collapses, attempted fraud, or controlled poisoning, which might have been his mistake. And the organisers, bless them, took notes. Well, not literal notes, because that would involve bothering with paperwork. But someone must have muttered something about water stations next time, or maybe fewer cars on the track, possibly fewer wild dogs. Sadly, no one seemed to object to the use of household chemicals as athletic enhancers, at least not immediately. The 1904 Olympic Marathon was technically the first Olympic marathon ever held in the United States. It was supposed to elevate the national spirit. It did, in a way, mostly by proving that, with the right combination of confusion, heat stroke, and very questionable science, a sporting event could become something more primal. Less competition, more parable. Even the weather seemed to give up partway through. A dry breeze blew bags of popcorn across the finish line 30 minutes after the last runner. A distant accordion was heard from the fairgrounds. It might have been playing a triumphant march, or simply accompanying a demonstration on French shoe polish. Either way, it felt oddly fitting. Decades later, when this marathon was recalled by historians, they often shy away from analysis, because there is no real lesson here. only a long hot afternoon where human ambition tangled with entropy, and everyone limped away vaguely confused about what had just happened. The dust from the crowds eventually settled. The roads were repaved. The sight of the finish line became a quiet strip of Midwestern suburbia, with no statue to honour the man who nearly died from ingesting rat poison in a performance-enhancing omelette. And somewhere in the archival records of Olympic history, the 1904 St. Louis Marathon still sits like an unlabelled can of food in the back of the pantry. You know it exists, you're just not sure it's safe to open. But maybe the last image to leave you with is this: a runner, barefoot and woozy, stumbling home through an unfamiliar city. He's not sure which way leads to the stadium, or even if he is still in the event. A small child offers him a slice of pie from a food stall. He accepts it with solemn gratitude, unaware that he has already finished the race 2 hours ago, and that the medal has been given to someone else entirely. There is laughter in the background, possibly imaginary. The sun is going down, and somewhere nearby a dog is still barking.